Welcome to Know What I Mean. My name is George.
My name's Oscar. This week, well, I was a little bit triggered initially this week. But after a bit of discussion, then I think it was clarified a few different angles on this quote. And yeah, we just got stuck into a really interesting conversation around presence, around what spirituality is, what are the different forms of spirituality, and personal examples. And yeah, it was just really enjoyable. I feel very present after recording it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I thought it was really interesting actually, because we had a bit of opinion changing, or like your kind of stance, changed on it. And it felt like we were really interacting and helping each other to like see things from different angles. I feel like I understand the quote differently to how I understood it at the start. Sometimes it feels more like we've both got our interpretations, and often they're quite similar, and we're kind of like talking about them and explaining them to each other. But here it really felt our ideas were like really interacting and changing each other, which I thought was really cool. So yeah, I hope you guys enjoy this. I certainly did. And let's get into the episode. So the quote I chose for this week is from Alan Watts, and it is: Zen does not confuse spirituality with thinking about God while one is peeling potatoes. Zen spirituality is just to peel the potatoes. So I guess I'll give a little bit of background about these two and kind of how I see them, and be curious to get your input as well. So I see the first instance as being, where you're thinking about God whilst peeling potatoes, is you're kind of seeing God, and I'm putting that in quotation marks because, you can, I'm using the term quite broadly, but you can think about God whilst peeling potatoes, and that is kind of an abstraction from what you're doing. You're thinking, you're the same way you'd think about a friend or a superhero character or something like that. It's something other than what you're doing. It's like a little, thing that you're playing in your mind. And the second one is about complete focus on the present of what it is that you're doing. And I'm not a religious person, but if you are going to try and find God, the best place to look, I would assume, would be in the present moment, like within life, like really just absorbing and looking and living your life. That is where you're going to find it, rather than just these thoughts about things. It's going to be much less profound, your thoughts, than the experiences when you really just completely commit to peeling the potatoes. That can end up being a really interesting and potentially like spiritual feeling in just complete focus in the present moment. So yeah, those are my initial thoughts. What were you thinking about it?
I was quite triggered by this one. No, I think it's...
Wait, can you check that your microphone is plugged in? I don't know if I've got it really loud or like it was sounding a bit funny.
Okay, it was being weird.
Yeah, no, that's good now.
Okay, great.
Yeah. You need to have your outburst about being triggered again.
I'm just catching the thought. One sec. So why was I a bit triggered by this quote? Well, I guess at the moment, the main practice that I'm doing is the 𝗢𝗲𝗿, the cultivation of loving kindness. And this particular practice, it's a model essentially, which is called the 𝗲𝗿 model, which is, it's an idea that spirituality is progressive and you're building, I guess. So I don't know if this is a direct translation, but since the 𝗢𝗲𝗿 is the cultivation of loving kindness, then I think that 𝗲𝗿 would translate as cultivation. So something that you are progressing or you're building. And intrinsic within that, and within this practice of the 𝗢𝗲𝗿 particularly, is you are using thought in that process. So the practice is in 5 stages, and you're bringing different people to mind in those stages, and cultivating a sense of compassion or kindness towards those people. So that there is a process of thinking in that. So it will be like you're thinking of a person, and then you are bringing awareness to the heart and seeing in the heart, in your investigation, if there is any kind of kindling of kindness there, and focusing on that. And just, it's not like squeezing kindness out, but it's like there is definitely a process of thought in there. And I guess with this quote, I would say, because it says Zen does not confuse spirituality with thinking about God, I think there might be a judgment in there of that thought, if we are going broad with what God means, that thought, if God could be exchanged with thought, as in, as you said, like it's something other than what is in the moment, or something imaginary, something you're imagining, it's sort of suggesting that you've been confused in thinking that that is spirituality, when in fact spirituality really is, or Zen spirituality is just to peel the potato, is just to be present. Yeah, and that's, I guess, why I was a bit like, I feel like there's a bit of a judgment in here of using thought to be a catalyst to something deeper, to having more profound insights, and saying maybe it's quite binary. It's either you're thinking or you're doing it properly, and that is to just peel the potatoes. That's just to be with what is going on.
Yeah.
However, saying that, I have in the last couple of days, I don't know if it's as a response to this quote or reflecting on it more, but I've really had some quite strong experience with mindfulness over the last couple of days, and a quietening of thought, and just focusing on what's going on is incredibly profound. So I do think that it is totally true that just to peel the potatoes is an amazing thing to do.
Yeah.
And I do think that it is possible for thought to be a catalyst to, that's not all there is.
Yeah. I think for me, the difference I see in those two things is actually like the split attention in the first one. When you're thinking about God or doing the metta, you're not peeling potatoes at the same time. You're completely focused on this thought and thinking about God, as it were. So I think that's, I guess, how I take it, or at least now after you saying that about how powerful thought can be, I see it as the dividing of attention, that you're not going to find anything profound in this distracted state of doing one thing whilst thinking about something else. So I see that as like the key difference between the two. But yeah, it definitely does sound like he's kind of putting it down a little bit, like he's being a little bit condescending about it, for sure, in that first bit of the quote. Yeah.
And you know, to put it in context culturally, Alan Watts was around in the 60s and 70s, and at that time there was a real rejection of Christianity. You know, it was like Christianity was musty old conditioned, sort of pretty like outdated model of what spirituality was. And there was a lot of kickback, because that, in a way, that was that was the dominant religion, and that was the dominant, that was in a way what is fixed and what is always been. And at this time, with like counterculture, then people like Alan Watts were very deliberately saying, actually, that's not it. Whereas now, in a way, we're coming to it at a different time. And I think the time of Christian bashing and like just being condescending essentially about the Christian faith, I think that's kind of done now. In a way, we're kind of like back to, because, you know, Christianity really isn't dominant now. It's you occasionally will meet a Christian, but overall, like, there's not so many of them around. And I think people have got it out of their system after a couple of generations of like, you know, saying how stupid it is to believe in God or whatever, you know, like I think people have more of a nuanced view about it now. So maybe it is, seeing it in the context of its time, it would kind of make sense that it was a bit of a kind of, you know, that's not it, and being a little bit kind of, because I think it seems kind of flippant. It's like a thing of half-hearted, like, oh yeah, I'm just doing this, like, oh yeah, I think about God, like I'm a spiritual person. And you know, you could do a similar thing
you know, like a more modern day, or like, well, I guess it's not modern day when it's like Buddhism, but like
It's older.
yeah. But with say meditation, you could be kind of into it and talking about it, but you don't practice it that much. You know, it's something that you talk about, but you don't do meditation or active meditation and like, or even, you know, deep inquiry and really like taking the time to do that. Because you can talk around on the surface and do all these things and construct arguments that make sense and talk about it as if you understand what you're talking about, but without really having the personal experiences that ground that. So the way I see the quote really is about like, if you're going to do something and if you want to find meaning in life, you really need to commit to something, even just in this moment. Either it is you're really inquiring about who you are, or you're focused on your work that you're doing, focused on enjoying your walk, or doing some other kind of formal meditation practice. Yeah, that's really what I get from the quote. And I wanted to give an example actually from today. I work at a restaurant, so we've got little pots that go with, you know, anyone who has a tea. So we've got like a load of sugars and stuff. So I was restocking those, going through them, and I was like, oh, this is a good time to like just restock the sugar. And I was just like, let me fully focus on doing this. And I found it quieted my mind, and I just really focused on it and found it really quite enjoyable. And also that's a great opportunity to notice your body can actually do a lot without you getting involved. Like as you're doing the sugar, you can just be like, oh, just watch your hands doing it and watch yourself going through the motions, because it's a simple thing that you can do without thinking. So if you often, what happens is, say you're doing like a kind of autopilot task, you'll be doing the autopilot task and then you'll be thinking about something else. But what you can do is keep the task on autopilot, but then put your attention into the present moment. And it can be quite a strange experience if you haven't had it before, or even if you have had it. And you'll kind of get varying degrees of strength of this experience. But by doing this, you can notice yourself just doing things, and it can be quite amusing just to like watch yourself on autopilot, but with full attention to your autopilot, but without feeling like you're the one who's getting the bits of sugar. You're like kind of amused watching yourself, how you can just do all these things on autopilot. I've never fully thought about it like that, but yeah, it's a really interesting thing to try. You know, next time you're peeling potatoes or any kind of simple task like that, you can give that a try.
Yeah, I guess starting the conversation, as I said, I was a bit like, I don't really like the tone of this this quote. But after saying your perspective on it, which is that the example given of thinking about God while one is peeling the potatoes, that is an example potentially of not wholeheartedly doing what you're doing. And I thought it was interesting what you brought in about how you could be doing the mayabhavana meditation or a meditation that requires imagination, and there can be a wholeheartedness there because it is you're still focusing on what you're doing. It just happens to be engaging the mind, which I think is a really interesting point. And then, but the example given in this quote is peeling the potatoes, and as you say, like that can be done on autopilot. It doesn't require thought to peel the potatoes particularly. You might need to count a few, you know, you might need to count them at the beginning or whatever it might be, but generally you'll just be doing this thing on autopilot. So the example given is something that doesn't require thought particularly. But yeah, you can be wholeheartedly thinking as well. And I think that is a really interesting thing to bring in. So I have an example from a couple of weeks ago when I was on a walking retreat. And this retreat, we were walking in Dartmoor in Devon, which is like a protected land. It's incredible. It's like this, well, it's this moorland, but it's very beautiful, like so many incredible like views and this incredible scenery. And there also is a lot of stone circles and really ancient sacred spaces in quotation. So like one experience that I had with these sacred spaces, because we did discuss them at the end of the day, and we were, you know, they were obviously quite a big part of our experience because we walked to these spaces and you know, they were curious, they were interesting. It was estimated that they could be like 4,000 years old, you know, so they're very, very old. But one thing that was happening with me in these spaces was that I felt the need to superimpose their sacredness. I really had to engage thought to imagine, oh, people who were here 4,000 years ago, what were they doing? You know, what sort of practices were they doing? What makes this a magical space? And I actually found that quite contrived. I found it quite difficult to do. That might not have always been the case. It might have been easy if I was in a particular mood and not so easy in another mood. But during this retreat, I found that since I had been doing a lot of very mindful walking where I was quite still, to then engage the mind and try and manifest a sacredness about this particular space felt, I don't know, it just felt a bit ill-fitting to me. And then another experience I had on this retreat was just that you'd get to the top of particular hills and you'd look out over the view, and it was just, that was such an incredible spiritual experience, you know, like just being aware of this incredible place that we were in. And that required zero thought. It wasn't a spirituality that required any thought on at all. It was just simply there, and that was enough. And so when I was reflecting on this quote from the perspective of that there is a superior spirituality, I guess, which is a thought-free spirituality, a pure spirituality of just being aware. From that perspective, this story, you know, of the sacred spaces and just simply the views just felt like an example that I guess proved that to be true in my experience on some level. But as I've said already, it's not, I don't think it's always the case, but I do think there is the space of not thinking is very particular, and it's one of those things that it's easy to forget how different it is to just simply be with what is without focusing on thought when thought is quite quiet. I guess because our landscape generally is thought-based, is concept-based, like all the time, as we've mentioned loads of times on the podcast. You know, it's like that, it's so normal to have a head full of thought, and quite loud thought, continuously from the moment you wake up to the moment you go to sleep. So that is the normal state of consciousness, and that is just the landscape you're in. To going from that very crowded space to a very quiet and open space, when, you know, that might be quite unfamiliar or rare, is very, very special and different. And I always forget that. It's only until I come back to it again, I'm like, oh wow, like this is so different.
Yeah, because in your head, like, it's always just a memory. Like when you're not there, all it is just like a memory and a story of like, I remember it being nice. You can't have that experience without being there. You know, that is it. The point is that you are there experiencing it, and no matter how good your imagination is, you can't conjure up the same thing without being there. And certainly not if you're just like thinking about like, oh yeah, that was cool when I went on that walk. It's so different when you're actually there. It's just a completely different thing. And it is weird how hard it is to remember that sometimes. Like I remember it when I used to go climbing with my dad a lot. I would often just not want to go for whatever reason. And, you know, when I would actually go, I would always have a good time. But for some reason, I had like this resistance towards doing it. There was actually one thing that I noticed from the podcast last week, and I realized it actually fit perfectly into what we're talking about, which was, it was when I was listening to you and I could feel, I think I was like tapping my foot, and I could feel that there was like a kind of fairly low level of anxiety, like a low kind of buzz of anxiety. And I realized that it was kind of, I don't know if maybe there was like a little bit of dialogue or monologue going on in my head, but it was more just like kind of a hum of slight discontent. And I found that when I actually stopped the physical action of tapping my foot, which I was kind of just doing unconsciously, and kind of just like refocused into listening to you, then the kind of feeling of anxiety went away as well. Like it was somehow connected to that action. That was kind of like a manifestation of that nervous energy, was through, me tapping my foot. And it was really interesting to notice that when I stopped doing that, that feeling went, and it meant that I could fully focus on listening to you as deeply as I could. And yeah, it was a quite an interesting little experience that happened. And yeah, definitely something that I will use, obviously, just in the podcast, if I ever notice myself like fidgeting a little bit much, then I'll just like stop myself fidgeting, focus, and then can really engage in the conversation as much as possible. And it's definitely something that I'll do, in general conversations or in my life, just notice that those little things, those little like nervous, fidgety things, often that can be like a nice trigger to be still, even though you might still feel the urge to tap your foot or, move your hands or something like that. And it's something that you can explore through meditation as well. I remember that being one of the big things that I noticed actually when I first meditated, was that like I don't need to scratch as much, because I would just commit to 20 minutes of sitting in the exact same position without moving or anything. And it was really interesting to notice, the sensation of feeling like I need to scratch, and noticing that, and then noticing that if you don't scratch yourself, that feeling just goes away very quickly. Like sometimes it can be longer, but usually it's like 5-10 seconds after you would have scratched, it's already gone. And that was just one thing I noticed, because I can be quite like a fidgety person quite often. And it's interesting to notice how that is actually so connected to your experience, or like how you're feeling. So you can actually change how your body is behaving, and that will change how you're thinking as well, and vice versa.
So is that connected to having your attention split?
Yeah. That's what made me think of it, was that it really did feel like that. Like there was some, say you've got like your bandwidth of like your total attention. It was like within my consciousness, it was like, 90% or 80% paying attention to you. And then there was like a 20% of just like slightly anxious or slightly fidgety sort of energy. And, when I got rid of the physical symptom, it opened up that bandwidth so that I could like pay full attention.
Yeah, I'd encourage anyone listening right now to just have a quick scan of if that's the case in this moment. I think it's so often the case, is that there is a, an underlying sense of anxiety or a particular narrative, or like some sort of discontent kind of shuffling or like moving or fiddling or whatever. Not that, fiddling with things is like bad particularly, but it's just that it can reflect that in a way you're kind of keeping your options open as to what your attention's doing in that moment. No, it's like I can't give, there's almost a bit of a danger in complete wholehearted attention, which is something really interesting in meditation. It's very common. I mean, I've had it loads of times where I will particularly be doing concentration meditations, so like a breathing meditation, for example, and I'll only be able to go to a certain amount of depth, and then I'll start to react against it, because my attention's getting narrower and narrower and getting more and more present, basically. But it feels quite dangerous, actually, to be bringing your attention down right to that point, because it feels like thought, particularly, has a job of keeping alertness of threat. And there's not, in a way, because it's unfamiliar territory, to be so concentrated, it feels like difficult to trust in that presence to really take care of you, because it's not been your life experience. Your life experience has been to think. So when thought dies down to a certain point, it actually gets quite scary. And it's really that's a really, really funny thing to notice, is you start to feel, I've had it, like, start to feel because if you're very concentrated, you generally do feel very good and peaceful and really quite collected. And I'll get to a certain amount of pleasure and a certain amount of kind of peace and collection, and I'll be like, that's enough. And then I'll start to like think about something, or I'll start fidgeting, or I want to end the meditation, like that might come up, like, I'll just kind of think of something that I need to do, or like whatever, I'll start moving around. And it's really funny, like that point, finding that point of kind of reaction, and like how deep can you actually go with it.
And then each time you're going to have different levels of that are going to happen, like, along the way. Like, you'll have little initial ones of like, actually maybe I can do this later, or like like there's going to be that obviously before you start, but like once you start, there's going to be little levels, and it's almost like these little things that you pass. Like, once you have this kind of urge to stop, or to change, or to start fantasizing about something, or daydreaming, or whatever it is, you kind of getting tempted. But each time you stop that, that is the practice, is like bringing yourself back and not giving into that temptation. And then it's kind of feels like there's levels to it. Like, you keep on like having this come in, and then you've got to like let that go to the next level.
Yeah, that is definitely the process of meditation. Well, that seems like a good point to go on to next week's quote.
Yeah, what you got for us?
I actually picked up this book. It's called Stillness Speaks by Eckhart Tolle. I picked up this book in reference to the quote that we've just been talking about, and I flipped it over on the first page, and I was like, that is just simply too good to not have an episode for itself. So I shall read it out. When you lose touch with inner stillness, you lose touch with yourself. When you lose touch with yourself, you lose yourself in the world.
Very nice. I like that. That's a good one to think on as well.
It is, yeah. You need to. I might actually just read it one more time. I'm just going to read it. I think it's one of those ones. When you lose touch with inner stillness, you lose touch with yourself. When you lose touch with yourself, you lose yourself in the world.
Awesome.
Yes, mull it over. Thank you so much for listening. Yeah, it's been great. We've actually had our listenership increase recently and received some really lovely feedback. It's so nice to hear from you. If you ever want to get in touch, then just, don't hesitate. Please do. It's just amazing to hear from you. We have our Instagram, which is knowwhatimean.podcast, and our email is in the description below. Also, any feedback that you have, like just generally things that you find annoying and want to improve, we are very open to feedback like that, I would say. And if we're not, that's our shit. That's our egos and needs crushing. So you can help us do that.
Yeah.
And if you generally enjoy this podcast, then the greatest gift you can give to us is to tell someone about it, to tell a friend about it, to just send it over to them and just say, these two people are wonderful. I love this podcast, or however you want to put it. And that's how we're going to grow. And it's been great to hear that that's been being done by some listeners recently. It just means so much. Yeah. So thank you so much for listening, and we will see you next week.
Peace.